Hello, my name is Aaron. This is Casey Mo Reacts, and today we are continuing to react to The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which isn't the actual title of the book. It's actually like, an inquiry into the origins, blah, 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 The Wealth of Nations, because they really did not believe in brevity in terms of books or chapter headings or anything like that. So this is basically because I've never read the book, The Wealth of Nations before, and I thought, if I haven't, then a lot of people out there probably haven't either. We talk a lot about, the problems of capitalism and late stage capitalism and stuff like that. And that makes me wonder, what was the original vision? Because this book was written in the Enlightenment, which was a period in which there was a lot of progressivism and a lot of optimism about the future and about what humanity was capable of, what humanity was willing to do. And this is just so basically, my academic background is in applied anthropology. So I'm not an economist. I'm not trained as an economist. I have a lot of opinions on economics. I have a lot of fundamental theoretical frameworks that they use and the assumptions that are made in economics. I know that there's one of the things that I've noticed is that economics is often like used to describe very accurately a lot of things that have nothing to do with economics, but it really seems to struggle when you have people from when you have headlines of one. I remember back. Okay, there used to be these things called newspapers, and there used to be a newspaper called USA Today, which wasn't like the best newspaper, but it was popular. It was available around the country. You got it as like as a paper in like hotels and places like that. It was had a lot of national news in it. And I remember one day there was a front page article saying that the problem was that we had too much consumer debt, too much credit card debt, and that it was inevitably going to lead to a collapse. And this was like mid 2000s. I want to say like 2005, maybe 2006, somewhere around there, I want to say. And then the next day, and it was by an economist. And the next day, there was another article from the same paper saying that, interviewing another economist who was saying that the problem was that debt was too hard for Americans to get. So we need to loosen the restrictions on creditworthiness and encourage people to take out more debt because that's what would save the economy. That's the kind of thing that kind of makes my brain lock up, because you have somebody who is, an economist who says one thing, and then the next day have another economist who says the exact opposite thing. And how do you get there's so little consistency? It just depends on which school of thought do you subscribe to, and that's going to be impacted by how you view the ideal systems that you want to have in place. And honestly, because I remember when I was looking at grad school, one of the places that was trying to recruit me was the School of Business at my alma mater, and they into their MBA program. So I looked at some of the textbooks that they had and sat in on a couple of lectures to see what was going on, see what exactly they taught. Because I have my own problems with how business is done, and they're like, well, we need people like you to come in and like transform business culture. Okay, I mean, I have experience with big businesses and the problems of big business culture. And so, okay, fine, I'll give you a shot. So I start reading this in, and the definitions that were being used were they were wildly at odds with anything that I thought. For example, the literal textbook definition of capitalism that they were teaching. This may have just been a snapshot of like a particular time and a particular place, may not be like overall how everything is taught or was taught at the time. There may have been changes. I don't know. I just know this was like introductory for that school of business at that time. We're talking like 2007 to 2008. I graduated in 2008 with my undergrad. And I did go into grad school, but not this. And a lot of it was based on two things. First of all, my mentor was like, you do not, if they're not willing to fully fund you, then you're in the wrong graduate program. And because if you're not being offered a full ride, then they don't see value to having you in their program. And and it turns out that like business schools do not give fellowships and stuff. So I was just kind of, you know what? He's probably right because MBAs are kind of commoditized and stuff like that. So part of it was predicated on this textbook definition of capitalism, which was that capitalism is defined as a system where you have a secondary market for investments, such as stocks and bonds and things like that it can be traded on. Okay, absolutely fine. That is like a very basically capitalist society, according to that definition, or a capitalist system is one that where you can take ownership or a stake in a company and you can sell it to somebody else. Okay, I'm fine with that. But then it went on to say that a capitalist society, a capitalist system, depends on the full leveraging of assets. So basically, everything should be all of the things that you own, that a business owns, should be in some way something that you borrow against, something that talk about 2007 2008, and you see all of these, you see the collapsing of the markets and stuff, and it's like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Maybe we shouldn't, maybe there should be breaks on this. Maybe we shouldn't be saying that that the ideal situation is that you literally have no equity in anything because you're constantly borrowing against it. And I mean, don't get me wrong, you know, if you have like a house and you want to borrow against the value of the house with a home equity line of credit or something like that, perfectly fine, you know. You know, like, you know, but what they're saying is okay, yeah, have that line of credit, now go max it out so that you can pay as much interest as you can to the people who issued that, because that's what makes that, because the true goal of it is to make those companies and those institutions that extend you that credit, you should be maxing out with them. You should be giving, you should be, if they offer you $100,000 line of credit, then you should be maxed out on $100,000 so that so that you can improve the health of that company, of that institution. Yeah, no, I cannot agree with that at all. I mean, credit when you need it, good. Okay, yeah. You know, you want to be able to do something good. You want to be able to build something a lot of times before you can afford to pay for the whole thing up front. As long as you have a sustainable business plan, that's great. But this has nothing to do with sustainability. And you know that really plays into the whole concept of vulture capitalism and vulture investments and things like that. Uh, and if you've ever read, let me see, there's a book. Oh my God, it was written by, was it Inside Out? It was written by Dennis Levin. He was one of the guys who set up shop with Mike Milken. Dennis Levin was the stockbroker. There was him. There was Max Milken, who was the junk bond king, and there was uh, a guy who did arbitrage for them. God, trying to Ivan Boesky, I think was his name, and Boesky would find deals, and he would convince one company to acquire another, and they basically were the ones who invented they didn't invent, but they made it powerful that you buy a company and you issue debt based on that company. Now that debt is not rateable. I mean, it's not investment grade. It's junk bond grade. It's not something that a standard investor is going to even be able to buy into because it isn't investment quality. It's high risk. It's very pays a high interest rate and is only available to, I believe, accredited investors, which means that you have that you're, or a sophisticated investor. I can't remember which of those two definitions falls under the can buy these kinds of things. But anyway, it's not like you and me, right? It's a game for rich people. And what happened was there was insider trading going on, right? The deal would be put together Levin would trade based on the knowledge that these deals were coming up, and everybody was making lots of money. And what was happening on the backside was that there's one guy specifically by name of Perlman, not the actor, not anybody that you're probably familiar with today, but he was an activist investor, and he was buying these big companies, and he would reduce people's salaries. He would cut benefits and all that in order to pay the debt associated with these purchases. Leverage buyouts, it was pretty much all leverage buyouts. And I mean, like hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs during the 80s due to this, and a lot of those who were not who kept their jobs had greatly reduced incomes, greatly reduced benefits. And that's why, in my view, American households started losing out, was because of the activities of these. And Dennis Levin was like, here's how we fell into that kind of mentality. It was horrible, blah 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 blah, but this is what we did. And when I read it, it very much sounded like compulsive gambling. They're using other people's money to run up the score, and just going from one high after another, like, dopamine high, and always looking for that next score, always looking for that next big hit, and knowing, intellectually knowing that what was happening, but it didn't really matter because they were addicted to that high. What I want to find in this book is something that were safeguards envisioned to stop that kind of thing from happening, foreseen as an issue, or are these things that they just didn't think about. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. And okay, so the book one, Chapter 1, we did the introduction last session, of the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labor, and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. Chapter 1, of the division of labor. The greatest improvements in the productive powers of labor, and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied, seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. The effects of the division of labor in the general business of society will be more easily understood by considering in what manner it operates in some particular manufactures. It is commonly supposed to be carried furthest in some very trifling ones. Not perhaps that it really is carried further in them than in others of more importance, but in those trifling manufactures which are destined to supply the small wants of but a small number of people, the whole number of workmen must necessarily be small, and those employed in every different branch of the work can often be collected into the same warehouse and placed at once under the view of the spectator. In other words, you can walk into this and you can see how everything is divided between everybody because it's all taking place under one roof. This is bespoke manufacturing. This is something that, he's saying this is for, small things that are small number of people, probably wealthy people or specific businesses. In those cases, you can see everything happening under one roof. In those great manufacturers, on the contrary, which are destined to supply the great wants of the great body of the people, every different branch of the work employs so great a number of workmen that it is impossible to collect them all into the same warehouse. We can seldom see more at one time than those employed in one single branch, though in such manufacturers, therefore, the work may really be divided into a much greater number of parts than in those of a more trifling nature. The division is not near so obvious and has accordingly been much less observed. So what he's saying is basically, because you don't see all of the steps because there's so many of them, you don't see them together all in one place, therefore you don't understand how complex it actually is. You just see, oh, this stuff comes out of that factory there. You don't see the supply chain. You don't see all the feeder factories feeding into the same place. And that's very much like we have that today. I mean, this is describing how things are today. You have supply chains that are international. I used to work in quality control and an automotive parts supplier, and I also drove Expedite for 10 years over the road, and a lot of that was again automotive parts, and the supply chains are just vast. I mean, it is vast. It's incredible to me how anything actually gets made, because the amount of coordination necessary to get everything to where it needs to be in so many different little steps. I mean, it's just flabbergasting. And today it's actually easier because there's a lot more miniaturization and there's a lot more stuff that's actually fully automated. So you don't need as many people as many places. And in a lot of ways, then there may actually be less specialization among the people because there's so much more specialization among the tools. We, especially with the advent of like CNC machinery, where there are auto parts places where you have like one person running multiple lines. They just one person, and their job is primarily to feed parts in at one end and make sure that nothing gets jammed up. And if something gets jammed up, then either they know how to work on it, or they call somebody over who, an engineer who can work on the machines directly and troubleshoot, figure out what was wrong, and correct the problem. That is, in actuality, because the people aren't doing the work, the machines are doing the work. The labor force itself is not necessarily as specialized or as focused. Now, there is a lot of specialization and focus between brands of CNC machinery because they use different codes for these machines. I've actually heard that there is a movement changing to kind of make it more universal. So you have like a level of programming that takes the real world, the real language inputs of the people and translates it into the machine codes, that like the S codes and stuff that they use for the CNC machines, and that would reduce the specialization among those workers even at that point. And this would allow greater mobility between people, because at this point, if you want to get into CNC work, you learn one machine. Typically, you learn one brand's codes, and that's not going to be relatable necessarily to the plant next door, which might have a different brand with their own proprietary set of codes. And that means that because it takes time to learn how to use these machines. It takes time to learn how to put in the codes, to learn the codes well enough that you can use them on the fly on the production line. On the one hand, that means that, well, to the manufacturers, that can be very beneficial in that, oh yeah, you can't really take the experience here and have it directly apply at our competitor across the street. But it also means that when that company decides they're going to close down the facility, then they have to find a place that uses the same brand of machinery around them in order to be able to do CNC work or start back at the beginning, going into training. And that is less of a concern now than it probably was like 15 years ago when I first looked at that and looked at getting into CNC. And I just dismiss it altogether because the skills weren't really portable. It looked like they should be, but it just was overly specialized. Right now, the important thing is, in my view, for businesses, is portability of labor from one place to another. You want to be able to hire your competitors' people. In how many industries is it normal that you now have to work for a competitor in order to get a promotion, because promotions aren't handled internally? They're usually they usually bring in somebody from the outside if they have an opening to be your boss, for example. I thankfully work for a company where that is absolutely not the case, and and I'm very thankful for it, because I have seen how many businesses don't operate that way, and it really ticks me off, because it's like, well, in a lot of ways, we're seeing a change in, possibly because this was in the pre-automated days, right? I know the Industrial Revolution in England started a lot earlier than it did in the US. I think like early 1700s is when the first steam engines, they call them fire engines or something like that. It started there, and it took a lot longer to take effect in the US because we were a colony. We were a colony, and they wanted us dependent on them. And unfortunately, one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, was very much opposed to industrialization, very much opposed to it, thought that it made the country dirty, made people lazy, and was beneath the dignity of a free people. And businesses in industrialization was very soul crushing for the people of England. But anyway, let's go back to this. To make an example, therefore, from a very trifling manufacture, but one in which the division of labor has been very often taken notice of, the trade of a pin maker. A workman not educated to this business, which the division of labor has rendered a distinct trade, nor acquainted with the use of the machinery employed in it, to the invention of which the same division of labor has probably given occasion, could scarce perhaps with his utmost industry, make 1 pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it. A fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And in the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed, and where some of them consequently performed 2 or 3 distinct operations. But though they were very poor and therefore but indifferently accommodated with the necessary machinery, they could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons therefore could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Each person, therefore, making a tenth of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated into this peculiar business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not even 1 pin in a day. That is, certainly not the 240th, perhaps not the 4,800th part of what they are present capable of performing, in consequence of a proper division and combination of their different operations. In every other art and manufacture, the effects of the division of labor are similar to what they are in this very trifling one, though in many of them the labor can neither be so much subdivided nor reduced to such a simplicity of operation. The division of labor, however, so far as can be introduced, occasions in every art a proportionable increase of the productive powers of labor. The separation of different trades and employments from one another seems to have taken place in consequence of this advantage. This separation, too, is generally carried furthest in those countries which enjoy the highest degree of industry and improvement. What is the work of one man in a rude state of society being generally that of several in an improved one. In every improved society, the farmer is generally nothing but a farmer, the manufacturer nothing but a manufacturer. The labor, too, which is necessary to produce any one complete manufacture, is almost always divided among a great number of hands. How many different trades are employed in each branch of the linen and woolen manufactures, from the growers of the flax and the wool to the bleachers and smoothers of the linen, or to the dyers and dressers of the cloth. The nature of agriculture, indeed, does not admit of so many subdivisions of labor, nor of so complete a separation of one business from another as manufactures. It is impossible to separate so entirely the business of the grazier from that of the corn farmer, as the trade of the carpenter is commonly separated from that of the smith. The spinner is almost always a distinct person from the weaver, but the plowman, the harrower, the sower of the seed, and the reaper of the corn are often the same. The occasions for those different sorts of labor returning with the different seasons of the year, it is impossible that one man should be constantly employed in any one of them. This impossibility of making so complete an entire separation of all the different branches of labor employed in agriculture is perhaps a reason why the improvement of the productive powers of labor in this art does not always keep in pace with their improvement in manufactures. The most opulent nations indeed generally excel all their neighbors in agriculture as well as in manufactures, but they're more commonly distinguished by their superiority in the latter than in the former. Their lands are in general better cultivated, and having better labor and expense bestowed upon them, produce more in proportion to the extent and natural fertility of the ground. But this superiority of produce is seldom more than in proportion to the superiority of labor and expense. In agriculture, the labor of the rich country is not always much more productive than that of the poor, or at least it is never so much more productive as is commonly is in manufactures. The corn of the rich country, therefore, will not always, in the same degree of goodness, come cheaper to market than that of the poor. The corn of Poland, in the same degree of goodness, is as cheap as that of France, notwithstanding the superior opulence and improvement of the latter country. The corn of France is, in the corn provinces, fully as good, and in most years nearly about the same price with the corn of England, though in opulence and improvement, France is perhaps inferior to England. The corn lands of England, however, are better cultivated than those of France, and the corn lands of France are said to be much better cultivated than those of Poland. But though the poor country, notwithstanding the inferiority of its cultivation, can in some measure rival the rich in the cheapness and goodness of its corn, it can pretend to no such competition in its manufactures, at least if those manufactures suit the soil, climate, and situation of the rich country. The silks of France are better and cheaper than those of England, because the silk manufacture, at least under the present high duties upon the importation of raw silk, does not so well suit the climate of England as that of France. But the hardware and coarse woolens of England are beyond all comparison superior to those of France, and much cheaper too, in the same degree of goodness. In Poland, there are said to be scarce any manufactures of any kind, a few of those coarser household manufacturers accepted, without which no country can well subsist. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff about corn. And we're probably not talking about corn like we talk about here in the US, because in Europe, corn is just means like grains or anything like that. They're talking more about things like wheat and barley and things like that rather than corn. What this is talking about is commodities. Basic commodity at the time was food, and what they're saying is that in agriculture and commodities, there's only so much advancement that can be made. And most countries, regardless of their general development, most countries have hit a level at which they're all kind of competing on the same level. One country doesn't really have an advantage on any other unless there's an environmental benefit. But outside of that, you're not going to get the benefit of division of labor. And also labor is highly seasonal. So, you're not going to have a farmer who just all he does is harvest. He has to be able to plant. He has to be able to plow. He has to be able to do all the steps. And all the steps take place usually in different periods of time. So there's no real reason to divide up agriculture in that way. So what he's also saying is that this division of labor is not universal, and it doesn't necessarily bring benefits to every aspect of the economy. Where quality matters, like in manufacturing, that's where you compete in the technologically refined areas if you can. This great increase in the quantity of work, which in consequence of the division of labor, the same number of people are capable of performing, is owing to three different circumstances. First, to the increase of dexterity in every particular workman. Secondly, to the saving of the time, which is commonly lost in passing from one species of work to another. And lastly, to the invention of a great number of machines which facilitate and abridge labor, and enable one man to do the work of many. First, the improvement of the dexterity of the workman necessarily increases the quantity of the work he can perform, and the division of labor by reducing every man's business to some one simple operation. And by making this operation the sole employment of his life, necessarily increases very much the dexterity of the workman. A common smith, who, though accustomed to handle the hammer, has never been used to make nails, if in some particular occasion he is obliged to attempt it, will scarce, I am assured, be able to make above 200 or 300 nails in a day, and those two very bad ones. A smith who has been accustomed to make nails, but whose sole or principal business has not been that of a nailer, can seldom, with his utmost diligence, make more than 800 or 1,000 nails in a day. I have seen several boys under 20 years of age, who have never exercised any other trade but that of making nails, and who, when they exerted themselves, could make each of them upwards of 2,300 nails in a day. The making of a nail, however, is by no means one of the simplest operations. The same person blows the bellows, stirs or mends the fire as there is occasion, heats the iron, and forges every part of the nail. In forging the head, too, he is obliged to change his tools. The different operations into which the making of a pin or of a metal button is subdivided are all of them much more simple, and the dexterity of the person of whose life it has been the sole business to perform them is usually much greater. The rapidity with which some of the operations of these manufactures are performed exceeds what the human hand could, by those who have never seen them, be supposed capable of acquiring. So what he's talking about is that basically if you do the same thing day after day and that's all you do, you get really good at it. Secondly, the advantage which is gained by saving the time commonly lost in passing from one sort of work to another is much greater than we should at first be apt to imagine it. It is impossible to pass very quickly from one kind of work to another that is carried on as in a different place and with quite different tools. A country weaver who cultivates a small farm must lose a great deal of time in passing from his loom to the field, and from the field to his loom. When the two trades can be carried on in the same workhouse, the loss of time is no doubt much less. It is even in this case, however, very considerable. A man commonly saunters a little in turning his hand from one sort of employment to another. When he first begins a new work, he is seldom very keen and hearty. His mind, as they say, does not go to it, and for some time he rather trifles than applies to good purpose. The habit of sauntering and of indolent, careless application, which is naturally, or rather necessarily, acquired by every country workman, who is obliged to change his work and his tools every half hour, and to apply his hand in 20 different ways almost every day of his life, renders him almost always slothful and lazy, and incapable of any vigorous application, even on the most pressing occasions. Independent, therefore, of his deficiency in point of dexterity, this causalum must always reduce considerably the quantity of work which he is capable of performing. And actually, I mean, there is a lot of truth to this. Even when you talk about laziness and all that, I've done a lot of work with in retail as well as manufacturing. I've worked in so many different places, but anybody who's worked in retail, especially like restaurant food service, can probably relate to this, that on a slow day where you have quick spurts, it's really hard to get yourself into the headspace of now we're busy. You have that period in which you're like, oh God, this sucks because I'm not able to respond, to react. My body won't react in the way that normally is. My mind isn't. I'm just like, it's that being slow period really messes with you. And so I can understand where he's coming from. It's not necessarily being lazy. It's that it takes time for your mind to adapt. And of course, Smith relates this as being slothful or whatever. Whatever, screw him. He was just observing. He didn't actually do any of this work himself. So, thirdly and lastly, everybody must be sensible how much labor is facilitated and abridged by the application of proper machinery. It is unnecessary to give any example. I shall only observe, therefore, that the invention of all those machines by which labor is so much facilitated and abridged seems to have been originally owing to the division of labor. Men are much more likely to discover easier and readier methods of attaining any object when the whole attention of their minds is directed toward that single object, than when it is dissipated among a great variety of things. But in consequence of the division of labor, the whole of every man's attention comes naturally to be directed towards some one very simple object. It is naturally to be expected, therefore, that some one or other of those who are employed in each particular branch of labor should soon find out easier and readier methods of performing their own particular work, whenever the nature of it admits such improvement. A great part of the machines made use of in those manufactures in which labor is most subdivided were originally the invention of common workmen, who, being each of them employed in some very simple operation, naturally turn their thoughts toward finding out easier and readier methods of performing it. Whoever has been much accustomed to visit such manufacturers must frequently have been shown very pretty machines, which were the inventions of such workmen in order to facilitate and quicken their own particular part of the work. In the first fire engines, and I think this is referring to steam engines. Remember, I made that comment about they used to be called fire engines or something. A boy was constantly employed to open and shut alternately the communication between the boiler and the cylinder, according as the piston either ascended or descended. So they had a boy who sat there, and as the piston went up and down, would open or close the firebox. Interesting. One of those boys who loved to play with his companions observed that by tying a string from the handle to the valve, which opened this communication to another part of the machine, the valve would open and shut without his assistance and leave him at liberty to divert himself with his playfellows. One of the greatest improvements that has been made upon this machine since it was first invented was in this manner the discovery of a boy who wanted to save his own labor. I mean, yeah, this is exactly how innovation happens. All the improvements in machinery, however, have by no means been the inventions of those who have had occasion to use the machines. Many improvements have been made by the ingenuity of the makers of the machines, who when to make them became the business of a peculiar trade. And some by that of those who were called philosophers or men of speculation, whose trade is not to do anything but to observe everything, and who, upon that account, are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects in the progress of society. Philosophy or speculation becomes, like every other employment, the principal or sole trade and occupation of a particular class of citizens. He's talking about consultants here. He's talking about consultants, and somebody who can actually do consulting work and like business. What he's talking about is basically, I mean, specialists. You need specialists, right? But a lot of times, specialists get bound into what it is that they are doing specifically. They can find ways to make things better for themselves, but sometimes the solution to the problem isn't really having to do with what you're actually physically doing yourself. Could be something taken from another field that that maybe if you don't bring those two things together, nobody realizes that there can be this benefit. That's supposed to be what a consultant does. Problem is how do you know when a consultant is actually able to bring value to the table? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes I sit down with someone, I'm like, oh, like you already know what you're doing, and I really can't bring anything to the table. All I can do is say you are on the right track. And I actually like it when that happens, because that means that I like to see people who are successful. I like to see people who already have that kind of, who have already done the research and understand what it is that they need to do. And sometimes they just need a little bit of an encouragement, or somebody have somebody else tell them, yes, this is what you need to do, good job. And sometimes they want you to continue to work with them, check in with them from time to time, just to make sure that they're still on the right track. Because even if somebody is not a specialist in exactly what they're doing, it acts as a second set of eyes, a second brain, someone who can bring different knowledge to the table and different experiences. That could be a valuable thing, especially to a small organization, or someone working by themselves. Like every other employment too, it is subdivided into a great number of different branches, each of which affords occupation to a peculiar tribe or class of philosophers. In the subdivision of employment in philosophy, as well as in every other business, improves dexterity and saves time. Each individual becomes more expert in his own peculiar branch. More work is done upon the whole, and the quantity of science is considerably increased by it. It is a great multiplication of the productions of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labor, which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. All right. In a well-governed society, that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of people. And there you have it. Governance. You need good governance to make sure that this happens. Every workman has a great quantity of his own work to dispose of beyond what he himself has occasion for. And every other workman being exactly in the same situation, he is enabled to exchange a great quantity of his own goods for a great quantity, or what comes to the same thing, for the price of a great quantity of theirs. He supplies them abundantly with what they have occasion for, and they accommodate him as amply for what he has occasion for, and a general plenty diffuses itself through all the different ranks of the society. Now, what this is actually talking about is pay. This is salary. This is, if everybody is being productive, everybody should be paid for being productive. Should have a cut in that in that extra productivity, and that extra productivity then is something that they can use to buy extra productivity from others. In other words, money. That's what he's talking about. The laborers should be getting a cut of the value that they bring, not just on top of a base salary. That's what he's talking about. Observe the accommodation of the most artificer or day laborer in a civilized and thriving country, and you will perceive that the number of people of whose industry a part, though but a small part, has been employed in procuring him this accommodation, exceeds all computation. The woolen coat, for example, which covers a day laborer, as coarse and rough as it may appear, is a produce of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. The shepherd, the sorter of the wool comber or carder, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete even this homely production. How many merchants and carriers besides must have been employed in transporting the materials from some of those workmen to others who often live in a very distant part of the country. How much commerce and navigation in particular, how many shipbuilders, sailors, sailmakers, rope makers must have been employed in order to bring together the different drugs made use of by the dyer, which often come from the remotest corners of the world. What a variety of labor, too, is necessary in order to produce the tools of the meanest of those workmen, to say nothing of such complicated machines as the ship of the sailor, the mill of the fuller, or even the loom of the weaver. Let us consider only what a variety of labor is requisite in order to form that very simple machine, the shears with which the shepherd clips the wool, the miner, the builder of the furnace for smelting the ore, the feller of the timber, the burner of the charcoal to be made use of in the smelting house, the brickmaker, the bricklayer, the workmen who attend the furnace, the millwright, the forger, the smith, must all of them join their different arts in order to produce them. Were we to examine in the same manner all the different parts of his dress and household furniture, the coarse linen shirt which he wears next to his skin, the shoes which cover his feet, the bed in which he lies on, and all the different parts of which compose it, the kitchen grate at which he prepares his victuals, the coals which he makes use of for that purpose, dug from the bowels of the earth and brought to him perhaps by a long sea and long land carriage, all of the other utensils of his kitchen, all the furniture of his table, the knives, the forks of his table, the knives, the forks, the earthen or pewter plates upon which he serves and divides his victuals, the different hands employed in preparing his bread and his beer, the glass window which lets in the heat and the light and keeps out the wind and the rain, with all the knowledge and art requisite for preparing that beautiful and happy invention without which these northern parts of the world could scarce have afforded a very comfortable habitation, together with the tools of all the different workmen employed in producing those different conveniences. If we examine, I say, all these things and consider what a variety of labor is employed about each of them, we shall be sensible that without the assistance and cooperation of many thousands, the very meanest person in a civilized country could not be provided, even according to what we very falsely imagine, the easy and simple manner in which he is commonly accommodated. Compared indeed with the more extravagant luxury of the great, his accommodation must no doubt appear extremely simple and easy, and yet it may be true perhaps that the accommodation of a European prince does not always so much exceed that of an industrial and frugal peasant, as the accommodation of the latter exceeds that of many an African king, the absolute masters of the lives and liberties of 10,000 naked savages. Wow, that was like one hell of a paragraph that ended on a very poor note, I would say. Yeah, but basically, this is kind of, I don't know, with the way in which we have been taught, or at least my generation. I was born in 1976, and I remember people being very dismissive of anybody who does not have a college education. Of course, this guy, he's living and writing in a time when college education was very infrequent, and but he's there basically talking about how it takes everybody working together to do these things, and that everybody is interdependent on everybody else. And he talked in the previous paragraph, he talks about, why that in a well-governed society, that each of these people who contribute to all of this stuff gets a cut of the value that they bring to it, not just a basic salary, but hey, if without you, we could only produce 200 pins in a day, but your presence allows us to make 2,000 pins in a day. You get a cut of that. That's not a line that we hear very much these days from today's capitalists. Not really, not really. It um. Hmm. Has a powerful paragraph. I think two powerful paragraphs. Uh, just toss out the one about savages. That's just a cultural thing from the time. But anyway, so that was the first chapter of the first real chapter of this book. Yeah, if you enjoyed it, if you think that this is something that you'd like other people to hear, like, subscribe, hit the bell so you can be notified when the next video hits. And maybe next week, it could be the following week. I don't know. It depends on my own schedule. I may do this live, and I may record this live, and just um, I'm thinking about doing that. I was thinking about doing that today, but apparently there's like a 24-hour cooling off period when you say, "Hey, I want to go live." for the first time. And so I didn't know that. So I went ahead and recorded this as is. But anyway, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you for watching. And you have a wonderful day.